Hey everyone, it's Mr. Comerford, and in this video lesson we will be discussing the structure and the function of carbohydrates as well as the sources of foods that contain them and where you can find them in your diet, and even some specific examples. And we'll begin on the smaller end of the spectrum and we will work our way toward building an actual carbohydrate. You might remember from the video lesson on dehydration and hydrolysis reactions that um, macromolecules or polymers are these large molecules that are made of smaller pieces that are hooked together end to end to end. And carbohydrates are one example of these types of molecules. So a carbohydrate is a big molecule made of many smaller molecules, and those smaller molecules, or the monomers, remember that term from before, the monomers of a carbohydrate are these things called monosaccharides. These are the individual building blocks of a carbohydrate. So break the word down with me here for a second. Mono and saccharide. Mono means one, and saccharide means sugar. So carbohydrates are complex molecules that are made of individual sugar molecules, or monosaccharides. Here's some examples of some monosaccharides down below. Glucose is a very, very common monosaccharide that we'll be discussing a lot this year. It is pivotal in the formation of cellular energy that keeps your cells alive. Fructose is yet another example of a monosaccharide. It's got a slightly different chemical structure than glucose, and it is the sugar that is found in fruits and makes them taste sweet. Galactose is yet another example of a monosaccharide. So there's many different monosaccharides. There's not just one. And this is a monosaccharide that is found in the sugars of your milk that you drink. So there's many different kinds of monosaccharides, but if we start to put them together end to end to end, they will make larger sugar molecules and these polysaccharides that you see in the lower right-hand side of your screen, and eventually carbohydrates. In fact, let's talk about two of the monosaccharides that you see in front of you. Let's talk about glucose and galactose. So if we were to take these two and stick them together, so I'm just going to redraw them down here below. So if we were going to take glucose, and I'll just redraw it as this hexagon shape that you see. So here comes our glucose, and we were going to add it to galactose. So there's our galactose molecule. We're going to add these two things together. We are taking one monosaccharide and we are adding it to another monosaccharide. So we have mono plus mono, two monosaccharides added together, and what we would get as a result is a disaccharide. So these two would be chemically bonded together now in a chain of two molecules, and this would be called a disaccharide, where di means two and saccharide again means sugar. And this is a sugar that you know of. Again, I told you that galactose is found in milk. Well, if you take one glucose molecule and you add it to one galactose molecule, you get a disaccharide known as lactose. So lactose, of course, is a very famous example of a disaccharide. So we've worked our way from one, a monosaccharide, now to two, a disaccharide. And we're going to skip then multiple steps to come to our next type of molecule, a polysaccharide. And in previous video lessons, we've already discussed that poly means many, and here's saccharide again, just meaning sugar. So a polysaccharide here is our polymer. This molecule, a polysaccharide, is the polymer that we're talking about. It's the large molecule made of lots of smaller molecules hooked together. And you can see this example that we're discussing right here, starch, it is a very famous example of a polysaccharide. And when you look closely at it, it's just these individual, you can see that three of them have been highlighted here, and we're zooming in to see those three, but it's individual sugar molecules, individual monosaccharides all linked together, not only to form this sort of central chain, but there are branches off of this chain and branches off of those branches. So we have a very long and a very complex molecule called starch, which is an example of a polysaccharide, which is made of many, many, many monosaccharides hooked together in a line, in a sequence with many different branches. Now, speaking of starch, which we see up here where I've just highlighted, it's one of many examples of very common polysaccharides or carbohydrates that we find in our cells, in the cells of other living things, and therefore in our diet. So let's begin talking about starch. So starch, as you saw on the previous slide, is just a whole bunch of individual glucose molecules, and here they are, linked end to end to end to end to form a very complex long chain called a carbohydrate. And starch is something that is very common, a carbohydrate that's very common in certain types of foods. For example, as we see from this diagram, it can be found inside potatoes. It's also found in many grains like wheat and rice and quinoa and those types of crops that are grown out of the ground. Starch is also prevalent in things like corn. So many different crops contain this long complex carbohydrate called starch. But there are other examples of carbohydrates as well. One that can be found inside of your body, it's called glycogen. And glycogen, very similar to starch, is just a whole bunch of glucose molecules linked end to end to end to end, but there's a slightly different manner in which they link. So notice that just sort of the branching pattern here of these glycogen or of these glucose molecules is slightly different than what we see in the starch molecule. Now, starch, if we talk about function for a second, starch is an excellent source when you eat it as a part of your diet of immediate energy, and here's why. These chemical bonds that you see here and here and here in between those glucose molecules, those all contain a really, really, really important thing called energy. And when your body digests, when you break that bond, and when you break that bond, and when you break that bond using the types of reactions that we've previously discussed, are hydrolysis reactions. When your body breaks those bonds, it releases energy. Go back and look at the hydrolysis, the dehydration and hydrolysis video lesson. Energy is released that now your cells can use to power themselves on a regular basis. Glycogen is a little bit different. Glycogen is a molecule that is used to store energy. So when your body takes a bunch of extra glucose molecules and doesn't use them, it wants to link them together to store them for later. So now, glycogen, you have made all these chemical bonds that link these glucose molecules together, and you have stored that energy, and that energy is stored now in your muscle fibers. So if you haven't eaten in a very long time, for example, and you don't have some potatoes or some corn or some rice or something like that in your body, you're probably going to be pretty low on energy. So your body will tap into your muscle tissues and you will start digesting your own carbohydrate in order to get those individual glucose molecules in order to have energy for your cells. So starch and glycogen are similar yet different. They're both carbohydrates. They're both made of these chains of glucose molecules, but one can be found in plants and crops. Oops, sorry about that. Plants and crops like potatoes and corn and wheat and things that can be made from those products. Whereas glycogen is found in the muscle tissues of animals as a storage device so that we can have energy if we need it and we haven't eaten in a very long time. Now let's talk about the final example that's on this page, which is called cellulose. Cellulose is also found in the tissue of plants, not in any tissue that you have, but in the tissue of plants. And when you look at this diagram, look at how cellulose forms this very intricate sort of woven pattern of fibers. And when you unwind those fibers, you see that they're just these glucose molecules that are linked end to end to end, which is what all carbohydrates are, these linked glucose molecules. Oops. But notice the way that these chains of glucose molecules are oriented to each other. They have some hydrogen bonds in between them, and you can go back and you can look at the video lesson on hydrogen bonds in the water and life topic. But these hydrogen bonds make cellulose very, very, very strong. And what's interesting, oops, sorry about that again. What's interesting is that these chemical bonds that hold those individual glucose molecules together, you actually cannot digest those chemical bonds. So where you can digest starch and you can digest glycogen, we do not possess the enzymes to digest cellulose. So that means that both starch and glycogen are very good at producing energy. I'll circle them both again for you. Starch and glycogen are excellent sources of energy because we can break the chemical bonds that hold the glucose molecules together. Since we cannot break the chemical bonds that hold the glucose molecules together in cellulose, it makes it very strong and makes it very structural. So cellulose, unlike starch and glycogen, is not used as an energy source, but is a building material. And if you eat really like crunchy vegetables, for example, think of celery or broccoli or things like that, the crunch, that is cellulose. And wood, which is very, very rigid, obviously, and is a structural material we use for building, is almost entirely made out of cellulose. So the structure definitely dictates the function, where the structure of these three different carbohydrates makes two of them really, really excellent sources of cellular energy, and one of them a terrible source of energy, but an excellent building material. That's all for now. There will be more next time. Thanks for listening.